Good morning and welcome to another edition of the CannaList Conversation. We are joined today with Mark Rosenfeld of the offices of Mark Rosenfeld, also known as Mr. DUI LA. Mark, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here.
So how did you get the moniker Mr. DUI LA?
So I started way back in law school interning at the public defender's office and then at a private firm that did some defense work. When I first got out, I did some civil litigation, decided that wasn't for me. I really enjoyed the criminal defense practice. And I moved back to LA. I was down in San Diego, moved back to LA, and I started working for a guy, and we did a lot of criminal defense in general, but focused on driving under the influence cases. So when my son came along and it was time to open up my own practice, I was trying to figure out what website it should be. And Mark Rosenfeld, DUI, is just too long for a domain name. But MR is my initials, and DUIs is what I focus on. Los Angeles is where I do it. So Mr. DUI LA, and I've been handling a ton of DUI cases over the years.
So Mark, obviously you know that our focus is on cannabis. So we want to understand, because this is a relatively new area, I guess, of the impact of, usage of cannabis and the DUI laws. Can you give us some insights?
Sure. So there used to be one type of driving under the influence years and years ago, and that was just if you were basically drunk driving. And that has changed over and over again. Every year, things get more and more complicated and usually more and more difficult for people who are driving. And it went from just driving, drunk driving to driving under the influence to adding a per se limit for alcohol, because that's what the focus was, a certain number. And the number used to be 0.15, then 0.10, 0.08, and now some states are going to a 0.05 on alcohol. And
just can we, if you don't mind, can we put that in context? What is 0.05? Is that one drink, two drinks? Just generally, what is that?
It's going to give, I hate to give the lawyer answer, but it's going to vary a little bit depending on the size of the person. The bigger the person, the more they're going to have to drink. So the alcohol level is going to be the same. A 0.05 or a 0.08 is going to affect the person similarly. But if they're bigger, they're going to drink more. If you have someone who's slight, one drink, two drinks, and then that raises another question, and we'll come back to that probably regarding cannabis, is, what is a standard drink? If somebody has one beer that, and they're small, that's not going to get them probably to a 0.05, but two beers could do it. If they're bigger, it may take 4 beers to get there. And when we talk about cannabis, what is a standard, amount for someone to consume of cannabis? That's not there. But with the alcohol levels coming down, they're trying to throw a wider net to catch more people. And it's been very successful in reducing the number of people who are out on the roads drinking and driving. And then comes up the driving under the influence, not specifically related to alcohol, and then they divide the law. So it used to be just impairment, then they added a 0.08, for the longest time, and then they split it, and now there's a variety of subsections of driving under the influence. Driving under the influence, driving under the influence of alcohol, driving with a blood alcohol and it's geared towards Uber and Lyft drivers or drivers for hire, 0.05. Commercial drivers have a different limit. Then they add driving under the influence of drugs. Doesn't specify what type of drug, just if they're impaired from the drugs, or combined influence of alcohol and drugs. And this is done to be able to track what arrests are being made and what convictions are being made. And it's big business, and the court system is part of that. The court system is a business as well. They take in money, they spend money, and they try to keep track of that. So there are federal grants, federal funds, there's state funds, there's the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration. In California, there are the Office of Traffic Safety, which are all watching to see what type of arrests, what are the conviction rates, and what are people doing out on the road. So alcohol is by far and away the most prevalent drug that impairs, but the law enforcement, the court systems, and politics has shifted to drugs, and in particular cannabis. It's a very hot button issue. It's a very hot topic. And I would say that probably about 10 to 15 years ago, law enforcement started to gear up for cannabis DUIs, for drug DUIs, and started to train officers in trying to detect people who are driving under the influence of cannabis and make arrests for that.
And I believe, unlike alcohol, there's not a specific level per se of what it means to drive under the influence of cannabis.
That is correct. And alcohol is, as far as a drug is concerned, alcohol is really the exception to the rule, where alcohol, the more you drink, the more impaired you get, and the way that the body absorbs, distributes the alcohol, and eliminates it is pretty consistent person to person. When you switch to cannabis, you don't have that, and most drugs don't have that whether you have a novice user or a chronic user, someone who's using on a regular basis, what effect that has on the body, what the body can do to compensate for it. And it's not like alcohol where there's no tolerance to mental impairment. With drugs, there is a tolerance that gets built up, and someone can test positive and not be under the influence of it. So testing specifically for cannabis and trying to determine whether someone is or is not impaired from it can be a very tricky, very tricky activity and very difficult to do. And I get the question a lot, is there a test for it? How do they prove that? And there's a lot of money on the line. So there are a few big name companies that are doing a lot of research into trying to determine if there is some way to get a number, and then what does that number mean? And there are all sorts of issues with when the test is administered. But right now, there is no mathematical or scientific limit for impairment from cannabis, and it doesn't transfer from one person to another.
So if in the event you are stopped in a traffic stop or something like that, is the smell of cannabis enough to, suggest driving under the influence?
Well, depending on how the officer is trained, it used to be the strong odor of burnt marijuana meant something to an officer as far as conducting an investigation. But now with adult use, that's really a question whether that's grounds to conduct any sort of search at all. But an officer needs an escalating level of reasonable suspicion, probable cause to ultimately make a lawful arrest. To conduct a traffic stop, they have to have reasonable suspicion that there was a traffic violation. To then move to impairment or an arrest ultimately for driving under the influence of cannabis is going to require a whole different level of proof. And they do have chemical tests, urine tests or blood tests right now are what are used to determine whether there is a measurable amount of cannabis in the system. Now, whether they can differentiate the different types of cannabis, THC, CBD, active, inactive, is going to depend on what type of testing they're doing, whether it's just a screening test or whether it's a confirming test that's done in a lab. They may be able to determine a number, but that number doesn't translate directly into something. And the police officers out in the field are not going to have these numbers to know whether or not they should be making an arrest or not. So there are numbers that can be obtained, but that's usually down the road. And the question is, do the officers have probable cause to make a lawful arrest? What do they base that decision on? And the police do get, some police officers do get training on that. And the odor of cannabis, if it's even consumed that way, because a lot of people are not, smoking in the traditional sense, there can be an investigation.
And, if a driver is requested to take this test, are they obligated to do so?
If the person is on probation, they may have a term of probation that says they comply with an investigation, but normally the answer is going to be no. If someone's just driving down the road, they get pulled over for speeding, there's the odor of cannabis, do they have to agree to take the test? And the answer is no, but the officer will figure that into their analysis. When a officer is doing an investigation, if they are trained in a drug recognition protocol, and there are a couple different programs. There's the DRE program, which is the Drug Recognition Evaluation Program. There are other programs that are the Advanced Impaired Driving Program. They're going to start the driving under the influence investigation before they even have contact with the person in the car. So by the time a police officer walks up to the driver or passenger side, they're already well on their way to an investigation. What was the driving pattern of the car? And this is something with cannabis that is kind of bootstrapped into alcohol, and it doesn't really work that way. With the research on alcohol, it's very clear, the swerving, lane straddling, accidents, there's a driving pattern that is consistent with someone who's impaired from alcohol. With cannabis, it doesn't really work that way. You don't see people typically, there are high levels of someone who's, using while they're driving or something like that. But usually the driving pattern on a cannabis investigation, there's not going to be swerving, lane straddling, trouble maintaining the speed of the vehicles, too fast, too slow, following too closely. For low to moderate levels of cannabis, you're typically going to see someone who's actually driving safer than someone who's not had any cannabis in their system. It's just that the type of drug that it is not typically going to lead to risky behavior compared to alcohol, but police officers are trained on alcohol. A lot of times the DUI investigations come, there may be an accident, but not related to the cannabis. There may be a roadblock or a checkpoint, and someone honestly answers the question. They pull up to a roadblock, they're checking for alcohol, driver's license, and they will ask the question, have you had anything to drink? No, officer, I haven't. Have you had anything to smoke? And people will be honest and say yes. Now go ahead and pull over to the side. We're going to do a screening and a further investigation. And
so as a lawyer, when faced with that question, what should the response be?
Yeah, so it's a touchy subject because we cannot give false information to a police officer. We cannot lie to a police officer. Police officers can lie to us out in the field by the car, and they can get away with that in the name of law enforcement. But if we give false information, then we are obstructing, delaying a police officer. We're giving false information, and someone who gives that false information could very easily end up being charged with a couple of misdemeanor violations. So we can't really answer those questions and say, no, I haven't had anything if you had, but you can tell the police officer, the question is, am I free to leave? You get pulled over, the officer says, I pulled you over for speeding. Have you had anything to drink or smoke? Officer, am I free to leave? No, you're not free to leave. I'm asking you questions. If I'm not free to leave, then I'd like to invoke my right to remain silent. It's nothing personal. It's nothing against you, officer. I understand you're doing your job. but I'm not able to answer any questions. Every single question that a police officer asks is geared towards their investigation. If you think that when a police officer is talking to you, and I'm not talking about at Starbucks or at, lunch or something, or, a barbecue with friends, I'm talking about when the police officer turns on their lights and they're conducting an enforcement stop, they're doing business. And everything they ask, where are you coming from? Where are you going? How are you doing? What have you had to eat? These are all specific questions geared to eliminate defenses and lead them to arrest decision from somebody. So if you get pulled over and they ask, I wish I could talk to you, but I have a friend who's a lawyer. He says I can't talk. Am I free to leave? Is it going to upset the officer? No, we're not saying it in an aggressive, argumentative way. If they're going to write you a ticket for speeding, write the ticket, send me on my way. A lot of people have difficulty with that, and I understand you want to answer questions, but every question, are you under a doctor's care? Are you diabetic? Are you epileptic? These are all eliminating issues that could mimic or affect impairment or set up a timeline to prove when you consumed cannabis and whether the cannabis is affecting you at the time. They don't care if you're under doctor's care because they want to make sure you get medical treatment or you have an injury from a motorcycle accident or you're a veteran. They're not looking to get those answers to protect you. They're eliminating reasons why you may not perform well on their field sobriety test or their investigation to determine if there's impairment from cannabis.
And there's no differentiation between medical use and recreational use, obviously.
As far as driving, if you are impaired, you're no longer able to operate a car the same or similar as a sober person, then you're impaired. And whether it's medical or recreational use, if it affects you, it affects you.
And so if the driver chooses to invoke not responding, what is the likely next step that's going to happen?
So it depends on the officer. And at that point, the officer is going to have to rely upon that investigation they've done to that point. What was the driving pattern like? What was the person just pulled over for running a stop sign, or were they pulled over for multiple violations that could be impairment? The officer doesn't have a lot of information, and they may want to get the person out and conduct an investigation. The investigation could be field sobriety tests. Field sobriety tests were designed for alcohol, and then they use them for cannabis, and they don't translate that way. The science doesn't back it up that way. So if we're not going to do those field sobriety tests, we're going to elect not to do them. They don't have that information. If they don't have the information, they can say, well, the person didn't do, well, the person asked for a lawyer. That's what they're supposed to do. They didn't do the test. They weren't required to do the tests. But if you are lawfully arrested, they're going to do a chemical test, and that's going to be a urine test or a blood test, and that the person does need to do. Not so much for court, but for Department of Motor Vehicles purposes. You don't want to end up losing a driver's license because of a refusal. It can be much worse than just dealing with the DUI. But they will get a blood test and a number, but we talked earlier, what does that number really mean? So the less information they have, the better. Someone can be impaired from cannabis. It can affect their ability to drive safely, but usually you don't see that. Combined influence of alcohol and cannabis, that's a different story. That we can see impairment. So we may see low levels of alcohol. We may see, some, positive tests, some number on cannabis, but that combined influence can be a problem. Does an officer make an arrest? What else does the officer see in the car? Do they have a vape pen that's, sitting in the center console? Do they have a baggie that's sitting in the center console? That's going to lead to the officer believing there is recent use and therefore potential impairment from it. And it can result, and someone can be arrested, but I would rather be defending a case with less information than more. If someone does all the tests and all the tricks on the side of the road. And now I'm fighting not just a scientific number, but the officer's personal opinion based on all of these observations that the person's impaired.
So while I understand that this is not a legal recommendation, what I've heard is that if you are arrested, the best advice is shut the fuck up. Again, maybe not legal advice, but can you speak to that?
It is a very good idea to limit the amount of information that you are giving. And
See, this is a podcast. We can say those kind of words.
Okay, we get to a point where you get pulled over for a regular ticket, and at some point the police officer makes a decision that they're going to conduct a further investigation, and they're going to ask you to get out of the car. At this point, things have gone very, very wrong. The officer has, in all likelihood, made a decision to arrest. It's not 100%, but if they're asking you to get out of the car, that's the shut the fuck up moment. Because at that point, you are not free to leave. You cannot just get in your car and drive away. It is not a 5-minute, I'm writing you a ticket and sending you on your way. They want to get you out to get more evidence. And that's a big red flashing sign, stop talking. Because everything you do at that point forward is just going to give them more information. And if you end up getting arrested and the car gets impounded, bite your tongue. It's just not going to help. They're going to go through, and specifically with cannabis, what's the answer? The police officers, if they're trained in the drug recognition evaluation protocol, there's a 12-step process they're going to go through. They're going to do a breath test. It's going to come back nothing because you haven't had any alcohol, and they're going to believe that it's drugs. They're going to take your pulse, and they're going to check the heart rate. And if the heart rate is fast, then they're going to say you're nervous because you did something wrong. If the heart rate is slow, they're going to say the cannabis is acting as a depressant, which it's not, and slowing down your heart rate. Anything you give them is going to be harmful. So at that point, we have to stop talking once you're asked to get out of the car. And yes, if they ask you to get out of the car, get out of the car. Don't lock yourself in there. That's not going to go well.
And when this goes to court, is there a difference between a cannabis DUI and an alcohol DUI?
If there is a conviction, then the penalties are basically the same. It is a DUI, and it will have effects. Most of them are misdemeanors. It can be a felony, particularly if there's an accident, someone's hurt or something like that. But the penalties are basically exactly the same. The way that the case is defended is very different, and the number of defenses and type of defenses on cannabis are very different than you would have on an alcohol DUI. And it is important to have an attorney who knows cannabis. There's a very high likelihood that the prosecutor is going to be specially assigned from a drug prosecution perspective. Some prosecuting agencies, like the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, they will send certain prosecutors out for training. They will go through the law enforcement training. They will get the specific training on drug recognition evaluation so they can better evaluate and prosecute the cases. This works both ways. They know what we know, and they are aware of where the problems can be in the case, and you oftentimes can resolve or settle a cannabis DUI with a prosecutor who knows cannabis with a much better result than you would for an alcohol DUI. It's a completely different defense strategy, and the use of experts is also very important as far as being able to tell toxicology and impairment, whether you're talking about field sobriety tests and the reliability of those, as well as chemical tests and what they mean, and the individual person. So the way they're handled in court, it's still a criminal matter, and if convicted, has the same consequences.
And have we seen, as we move towards legalization and adult use, are we seeing an increase in these cases?
Yes. We see an increase in cannabis DUIs for a couple of different reasons. The prevalence of use is one. The stigma is reduced, and the mechanism for using the vape pens is just much easier for people to do, and you'll see a lot more of that. Also, there's fewer alcohol DUIs, which is great. Law enforcement, they're getting paid overtime. They've got a grant. They're trying to make a certain number of DUI arrests so they can win an award from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and you will see increased enforcement. If they can't get alcohol, they're going to be looking for drugs. The officers are getting better trained to screen for the drugs. So you are seeing more cannabis DUI arrests now than you did a couple years ago, and more a couple years ago than before that. So I think that trend is going to continue. Whether it results in convictions, that's a different story, because the science is not necessarily there at this point.
And, you know, if the science isn't there, then, you know, is that a defense?
Yes, because the prosecution has the burden of proving that you are impaired from the cannabis. And the technology, the science is not there to be able to say that you were impaired. You have a chemical test, which is usually a blood test. That blood test is given at some time later. So the person uses, then they drive, then an investigation is done, and then, you know, half hour, an hour later, there's a blood test. Well, an hour after driving, what difference does that number make? What was it at the time of driving, not what was it at the time of the blood draw? And what does the blood draw really mean? And that's why when we get to the investigation of the driving pattern and what happens on the side of the road that's closer to the time of driving, it's why it's important not to answer those questions or do those tests. And really, you know, think about the age of somebody, you know, with the baby boomer generation, maybe having had experience in the past, and the availability of cannabis being delivered to your door. You've got people who are older, who may have multiple medical or physical conditions using cannabis. And then if they're on the side of the road, they're trying to do, you know, walk a line, touch your nose. Well, they're never going to be able to do that. The tests were never designed for people of that age. They were never designed to be able to differentiate cannabis from not. You're going to have people failing tests on the side of the road. You touch your nose, you go home. You don't touch your nose, you go to jail. Make that decision at, you know, midnight with cars driving by. You're getting people arrested that should not be arrested.
And so, you know, as a sort of a closing, what advice do you have for folks when it comes to the traffic stop beyond don't talk?
And when it comes to the traffic stop beyond don't talk, is to put the officer at ease best you can. So when someone's getting pulled over, respond, signal, show the officer that you know that they're there. Do not stop on the side of the road. When I was in school, they said if some get pulled over, you pull to the shoulder and stop. Do not stop on the freeway. Do not stop in the middle of, you know, Wilshire Boulevard or Ventura Boulevard. Let the officer know that you know they're there, and then find a safe place. Get off the freeway, get off the main street, put all of the windows down on the car. No, you don't have to do these things, but it's a good thing to do. You don't want them trying to look through tinted windows to see if there's people in the back seat. You want to keep your hands on the steering wheel, turn the car off, and let them know that you appreciate what they do. Open all the windows so they can see, air out the car at the same time. But you want the police officer to be put at ease. They're not, you know, some officers are looking for DUIs, but most officers are good. They're not looking to arrest people for no reason. They can make mistakes like everybody else. So pulling off to a safe place, opening all the windows so that the officer can see what's going on, keeping your hands in sight. Yes, sir, no, sir, am I free to leave? If you do get asked to get out of the car, as we said, don't talk, don't do any tests. If you get arrested, it's going to take a little bit of time, but you're going to be all right. You'll go home, and then get the car out. If you are lawfully arrested for DUI, you do have to submit to a chemical test. The blood test is fine. There's a delay in time. We can look at the blood. We can see how it was analyzed. We could retest it if we wanted to, and we could defend it there.
So do I call you as I'm getting pulled over? When do I call you?
I do get calls when people are getting pulled over, but that usually that's not going to last. That's not going to last too long, and there is not too much I can do. If somebody is going to be arrested, it's got to be a terrible feeling and a helpless feeling. The handcuffs are going on. You're going into the back of the police car. The tow truck's coming to take your car. It's awful, but you just got to keep your mouth shut. Do the blood test. And depending on where you are, if you're in a big city like LA, you're going to spend a few hours. They're going to check for warrants. They're going to do fingerprint, photograph. I'm not saying it's pleasant, but within a few hours, you're going to get kicked out, usually on your own recognizance. You're not going to have to post bail on a regular DUI in LA County, and you'll be given some paperwork. And after that, you go home, you get some rest, you call a lawyer. You want a lawyer that's local. You want a lawyer that knows the courthouse, and you want a lawyer that knows not just DUIs, but cannabis DUIs and what the nuances are regarding how they're investigated and how they're defended. And then you work with the attorney.
And what led you to specifically the cannabis DUIs and defending?
I like people being treated fairly. I like justice. As I mentioned, I'm not against law enforcement. They've got a very tough job, and I respect them for what they do, but they can make mistakes, and the prosecution has to be put to its burden. They have the job of proving beyond a reasonable doubt every element of their offense. I enjoy helping individual people. When you think about DUIs, when you think about cannabis DUIs, it is normal, ordinary, everyday people who most of the time are driving safely. Now, they get caught up in this big net that the officers are throwing. As I mentioned, they will get awards, they will get overtime, and they may be out, specifically because of a grant of money that the department got to do this enforcement. And that's a whole different conversation. But most of the time, especially on cannabis, if they didn't get pulled over, they're getting home just fine. They're not going to hurt anybody, not themselves or anybody else. Alcohol is more risky, but people need to be defended. And there are officers that make mistakes. There's testing equipment that's not accurate, and we need to make sure that people are treated fairly and their rights are protected.
And of course, we're not advocating that people drive under the influence, but what we're suggesting is that you have a right to counsel, you have certain inalienable rights that you can invoke, and by all means, call an attorney. And by the way, shut the fuck up.
If they're asking you to get out of the car, shut the fuck up. And if you do get arrested, you do need to hire an attorney to help you through the process. We do not want people to drive impaired, regardless of what it is. And with the cannabis, it's really different. I mean, when you think of alcohol, you'll see people that will go out and they'll go to a party, they'll go to a club, they'll go to a restaurant, they'll have too much to drink and then drive. With cannabis, you don't see that pattern. And I'm less concerned. I mean, there's not like binging where someone is just consuming massive amounts of cannabis and then
and when they do, they don't typically get off their couch.
That's the thing. And if I had to give advice to someone as far as a drug to choose, I would much prefer someone go the route of cannabis than alcohol. Just the outcomes are going to be much better for you if you smoke than if you drink. And with any driving, I do want people to be safe. I want their cars to be safe. I don't want any equipment violations on the car. Make sure the car is in good working order. Registration is current. Headlights are working, turn signals, no broken glass, nothing hanging from the rearview mirror, no tinted windows up front, and keep the car in perfect working order. People get pulled over all the time because of equipment violations, and it's just an excuse, and it's going to end up in a big investigation. When it comes to cannabis, a lot of times that's what's getting people pulled over. It's not the driving. It's something else that is causing the officer to direct their attention. And then there is the admission where people say, yes, I have been smoking. And then it turns into a much, much bigger deal. I would suggest people plan, a little bit of planning can really help. We all know Uber and Lyft. For the last couple of years, people haven't wanted to use it as much, but it's still there. It's still an option. And I just implore that people plan ahead to make sure that they're going to get where they need to go safely and get home safely as well.
Sure. I mean, obviously, if you're going to consume whatever the substance may be, don't drive. That's simple, right? Mark, if folks want to learn more about you and get more information, I understand that you have an ebook that's available with regard to cannabis DUIs. Where can they find all this?
I do. Thank you for asking. MrDUILA.com, MrDUILA.com is my website. There's downloadable forms on the website for the ebook. You can also go to Amazon. It should be there as well. I'm always happy to talk to people and answer questions. I want people to be safe. I want them to get good legal advice, and I want them to get through any trouble they've got with as little problems as possible. I want to thank you for having me on your show today.
Mark, we appreciate your time. We appreciate the insights that you've shared, and we hope we never have to call you.
Absolutely, I understand. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Stay safe.
Thank you.